Today I'm privileged to speak to you at this Hazel lectureship at the Convocation on a topic of a book that I'm right now working on called The Jesus Who Never Lived. And this is an area that has become very important for us today because Jesus is the most important person who ever did live. The news media has been very interested in Jesus, usually around Easter and Christmas time. They reveal that, here's a person to talk about and take up some time on the news or the magazines. Unfortunately, when they do this, they don't seem to be interested in the Jesus who is recorded in the historical documents of the Gospels and has been held in common by the church for 2,000 years. They seem to find themselves far more interested in a reimagined Jesus, some new quirk about Jesus, some new manuscript that everybody's been they talk about new manuscripts that, we have evidence of and scholars have known about them for decades. And all these new things that have come up, they want to really deal with something less than the authentic biblical evidence and even the extra biblical evidence about Jesus. Jesus also is the favorite of ancient heretics, world religions, modern fiction novelists, Hollywood and television films, New Age teachers, popular religion, and over-the-edge liberal scholars. Everybody loves Jesus, at least the Jesus that they have created. He is by far the most popular person probably who's ever lived, but also probably the most distorted. And so thus I say the Jesus who never lived is the Jesus we often hear much about. The Jesus that we have almost no evidence about and speculate about is the Jesus the media becomes interested in. And so even as there were distortions at the turn of the first century and beginning of the second century with two quite divergent groups. One was the Ebionites, of whom we know very little, and I won't get into that discussion, but essentially a view that Jesus was only a man and nothing more, over against the Gnostics at the very end of the first century and beginning of the second century, whose writings began to appear toward the middle of the second century and not before, from all the evidence we really can conclusively demonstrate, who did not deny anything about the deity of Christ. Particularly, they denied the humanity of Christ, although Dan Brown apparently has never read any. So we have these two ways to look at Jesus, even in the ancient heresies. And then when you start moving to Jesus in the Eastern religions, Jesus even takes some interest there because he's an Eastern mystic. Even modern day people have argued that Jesus even went to study in India. Solid historical evidence for that he as a young man went over to India and that he learned by gurus how to be the Lord and Savior, I suppose. And no evidence for these, but people make lots of comments. Also, Jesus is a prophet in Islam. Now, you think about that a moment and realize about Muhammad. Muhammad said Jesus was born of a virgin, that he was sinless in his life, that he did miracles, that he actually ascended back to heaven and is coming again, none of which he is doing. And yet Muhammad is the last prophet and so apparently has the word. Jesus is popular in Islamic thought even, according to the Quran and some of the subsequent works. Jesus also is a Jesus who never lived in the works of the Enlightenment. Philosophers and biblical scholars in the period of the Enlightenment to the modern era have been enamored with Jesus, but not a Jesus that we find in the Gospels, but a Jesus who has been de-gospelized of a sort. And so we've had all sorts of quests. There's been 4 different searchings for Jesus, and they apparently still have not found him. The 4 quests, of which we are in the 4th, the most radical element of is the Jesus Seminar. There has been, again, a lot of interest in Jesus, but a Jesus different from what we have known historically in the church and the Jesus that we see in the authentic and verifiable documents of the New Testament period. So, there are contemporary distortions even today, not only in the scholarly world, of people like the Jesus Seminar, even viewed by liberal scholars as being quirks, and maybe even quacks, is that there is a sensationalistic view of history. People like sensationalism. That's why they follow fire trucks. That's why when something happens, crowds gather. People say, what is going on? And so that's how we deal with history. A lot of people in the general communities have never really taken the time to study history. They were doing something else during school. And so they don't even understand that some of the things being talked about are absolutely outlandish and outside any serious consideration of historical data. But it does sell newspapers and novels and even movies. Matter of fact, there's a recent one. Remember, the tomb of Jesus. Now we found the tomb of the Jesus family. And I could take a lot of time. We could take the whole time today and talk about that. I've been doing some reading on it. But let me assure you, maybe I should back up again. I noticed that they did find in one of the bone boxes, the ossuaries, they did find a bracelet. And the bracelet said, WWID, what would I do? And they think that might be an indication that that is in fact that is the tomb, the bone box of Jesus. But it's not conclusive because it had on the back of it something that said "Made in Taiwan." Now, there's also been the Gospel of Jesus that's been the Gospel of Judas that's been talked about. Scholars have known about this for a long time. Irenaeus, the great first theologian of the church in AD 180, wrote about the Gospel of Judas and refutes it, as he does many other Gnostic works. We now have a Coptic version of that. The original was probably more in Greek, and that itself could take an entire period of time, so we won't do that one either. I thought I'd get to one that's probably the most famous, and that is the Da Vinci Code, the Jesus who never lived. Because the Jesus who did live and the Jesus of the Da Vinci Code are radically different, Jesus says. Some of you may have seen the movie, The Da Vinci Code, or you read the book. Dan Brown, I've actually watched him on television interview programs. I've read the book thoroughly, marked up every page. And it's been a conversation piece because I fly and speak a lot of places, and oftentimes I see people with a copy of the Da Vinci Code, particularly in times past, in their hands. It starts up a conversation, particularly when I look at the very beginning of it, where we find out Dan Brown, how he presents it. Now, if you look in the fine print, always read the fine print, as you've been taught already. In the fine print, it says this book is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, organizations, places, events, and incidents either are the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, in events or locales is entirely coincidental. You realize that's a legal disclaimer. But it's far, far closer to the truth than is the next statement by Dan Brown in the title page. All descriptions of artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in this novel are accurate. That, in fact, is the very first fiction of the book. Now, if you look at how news people have dealt with this, I always say, if any of you are going into journalism, please excuse my comment. I used to be heavily involved in politics that we'll not go into, and I was with journalists all the time, and I usually had to give them handwritten statements, and even then they couldn't get it right. I say journalists, they're like skiers, that they just sort of work on the very surface of knowledge. They're not scuba divers who go in deep and never find anything much. They just sort of roam around the surface. Now, if you teach journalism here, let me encourage you to encourage people that are going to be in journalism to actually do the research. Because that's how people used to do it, and now we're too busy just writing comments and moving on. Listen to this. The most amazing thing about his novel is that it's based on fact. Our USA Today, almost like the Bible, the book consists of historical fact with a contemporary storyline. Well, so much for the news. This is a far better perspective. So error-laden is the Da Vinci Code that the educated reader actually applauds those rare occasions where Brown stumbles, despite himself, into the truth. That person deserves an A on their paper.